Many of your research projects will require you to use both primary and secondary sources. Before you can incorporate these two different kinds of resources into your research, you need to know what they are, how they are different, and how you can find them. This short video will give you an overview of what primary and secondary sources are and how they are used. What is a primary source? A primary source provides first-hand knowledge or representation of the time period in which it was created, the event to which it refers, or presents original research. Primary sources are free of interpretation or analysis by scholars and usually do not analyze other documents. Primary sources can include diaries, interviews, autobiographies and letters, legal documents and speeches, historical newspapers, works of art and literature, data sets or results of experiments and clinical trials, and video footage and newsreels. Primary sources can be used to support arguments, provide evidence, and often serve as the objects of research or study. Secondary sources are sources that are at least one step removed from the events they describe. They offer interpretation or analysis of primary sources. Examples of secondary sources may include essays or articles that analyze one or more primary sources, encyclopedias and textbooks, books that synthesize information from many different sources. Let's look at some examples to help us understand this. Suppose we are researching gender identities in the novel The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. Primary sources for this might include letters Hemingway wrote while he was working on the novel, newspaper or magazine articles from the 1920s that portray gender roles, A Movable Feast, a book Hemingway wrote about his time in Paris, interviews with Hemingway or associates from that time period, and the novel itself. Secondary sources might include a biography of Hemingway, journal articles providing criticism and analysis of the novel, and books about the history of Paris in the 1920s. In this example, the primary sources are all artifacts from either Hemingway or the time period in which he was writing the novel. The secondary sources are written after the fact and are at least one level removed from Hemingway and Paris of the 1920s. Let's look at some more examples. A data set from the Census Bureau would be considered a primary source, while an article that interpreted that data would be a secondary source. Likewise, a paper that gives the results of original scientific research and the text of a court decision are primary sources, while sources derived from them are secondary. Keep in mind that a source may be either primary or secondary depending on how it's being used. For instance, if you are researching the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, a New York Times article that analyzes the conflict would be a secondary source. However, if you are researching how the media portrays that conflict, the same New York Times article would count as a primary source. Once you understand the difference between primary and secondary sources, incorporating them into your research is much easier. For more information, including tips and resources for finding primary sources, consult Fairfield University's Primary Resource Guide. And don't forget that the librarians are always willing to help you if you have questions.